Okay, kids. Today we're going to talk about crime. We have Jeeta here, who's been in the legal game for a little while.
A little while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you like it?
Not my first choice.
No?
No.
What kind of law would you rather do?
Anything criminal, not criminal.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think commercial was first choice, but getting into criminal, like through my first job, which was at the registry, was kind of an easy pathway. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Because, I don't know, from my personal point of view, I always thought that, criminal law would actually be fun because it's like the really intense human aspects of shit compared to, I don't know, I feel like, commercial law is just people being boring. It's like, you owe me money. No, you stole my trademark. I don't know. I feel like that's what it is to me.
I think the reason that I prefer that is because it's very black and white. Or even if there is a grey area, there's no people involved. There's no emotions, and there's not very much harm in terms of physical harm.
Right.
So it's a lot easier to deal with. Whereas I feel with criminal law, you see a lot of stuff that you wouldn't normally see.
Right.
As a member of the public.
So in terms of that, do you find that it kind of takes quite a bit of an emotional toll on you? Does it?
I think it can if you don't know how to kind of detach yourself from situations. I think the problem with it is that you become really desensitized to a lot of things. Yeah. Which is part of the reason why I don't want to do it.
Yeah. No, fair enough. Okay. There's a question. You don't have to answer it if you feel like it makes people look bad, but given that, I mean, just from personal experience, right? I know, I've known people in the medical profession, etc. There were a lot of pissheads. People drink a lot. Do you find that people do that because of that? As a way to deal with things?
I mean, I suppose from observation I can say yes, but then is that just with lawyers or is that with New Zealand?
Fair call, fair play. Yeah, no, I do feel that's that is its own subject. I feel like especially at the moment, there's a lot of talk of mental health and dealing with shit, and I suppose it's an interesting time to be alive right now. So
definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, that's actually very interesting. I never thought of it that way, because I suppose it kind of depends on you and on your personality as well.
Yeah.
I suppose maybe I look at it from a point of view of somebody that doesn't give a shit, but then again, I don't know how I would feel kind of dealing with that on a daily basis as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's not easy. I don't think it's easy.
Yeah.
Yeah. But everyone's got their own coping mechanisms.
Okay. Is that I'm going to bring up the fact that you're a kickboxer now. I think this is as good a time as any. Do you find that it's a good outlet for you?
I think so.
Yeah.
Just being able to go into the gym and switch off and just kind of leave everything at the door and go and kick and punch things, it helps. It sounds a little bit violent, but no violent. There's no intention of violence there.
Yeah. No, for sure. I feel like it's kind of common knowledge now. If back in the day people used to think violent sports must be for violent people, but I think a lot of people understood that it's actually a good way to de-stress, to kind of channel that energy into something that's, it's good for you, because at the end of the day, you're doing something that's, I suppose consensual in that sense. You're not just kind of committing random acts of violence.
Exactly.
You're both there to do a sport, even if you're hitting each other, and most of the time you're not actually hitting each other. You're you're training.
Respectful.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, and in terms of say, your first choice, so to speak, commercial law, what I still, because to me, I still kind of find it a bit what is it about that kind of attracts you?
Appeals to me. I think it is just the whole. It's a little bit more black and white than criminal law. Obviously, criminal law is very, you can interpret it in a number of different ways, whereas commercial law, yes, but there's no, like I said earlier, there's no no, I suppose, but like less physical harm towards people.
So would you say it's kind of almost purely on an emotional level for you, more so than, like in terms of interesting work? Because that's kind of the way I look at it right away. It's just like, I feel like criminal law is more interesting. Like, it'll be more intense, but it'll be more interesting compared to, commercial law.
Yeah, agreed. I think for me personally, it definitely is an emotional thing. I've always found myself to be quite a logical person, and coming into criminal law, like you do have to use like emotional aspects to do your job, and I don't think I enjoy doing that as much. I prefer to see things logically.
Okay, that's actually quite interesting too, because I mean, like you almost feel like it's expected that you cut the emotions out.
Yes.
Because anytime you see any news or like, if you've ever watched a movie, it's always like, jury, like even they even tell the jury, like, jury, you disregard that, like you don't think about that, which is kind of funny. It's kind of like, unhear what you just heard. Don't take that into account. But it's just like, how are you going to do that as a human?
Well, exactly.
I can't unhear what I just heard. Like if I know it, I know it, and I'm going to, it creates some sort of a bias right away.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly. And that's exactly what it is with my work. If you hear certain things, you see certain things, you know certain things that other people don't, it obviously, like, your lived experiences make you think a certain way, and so when you hear those kinds of things or see those kinds of things, it changes how you should be thinking. Like, you should be logical, but then those little aspects of what you're being told or what you're seeing changes how, not necessarily the outcome, I suppose, but how you think about the situation that's happened. Okay. If that makes sense.
I get that. But in terms of, for example, what if it's a case where, perhaps you kind of, not necessarily have experienced something yourself, but you know of somebody close to you that this might have happened to, and you just kind of right away think about, it's just like, I know what, I know what that person must feel like, therefore, like it kind of brings that personal experience into that. Is, like in terms of that, are you supposed to do that, or are you supposed to try to steer away from that?
Definitely steer away from it.
Yeah.
I think personally I don't. That's one thing I like to think that I don't do, is like if it is somebody close to me or anything like that, I won't take that situation into account. But I suppose, it shouldn't be something that you do. It shouldn't be. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose, it's kind of like, well, you definitely have to, you have to try and keep it fair. Exactly. I mean, that's the whole point of it. Yeah. But at the end of the day, you're only human. You're going to have your biases. You're going to have your decisions, and that, and that is, I suppose, some sort of a. Well, I mean, that's the whole thing about justice. It's not quite so robotic. You can't quite fit everything into like a law. It's kind of like, this is how it is. It's just like, well, every situation is different.
That's it.
So, it's, like if we look at it from the point of view of, there's lawyers, there's judges, everybody kind of has to look at it from their own point of view, and everybody is open to their own interpretation, and therefore, I suppose the outcome doesn't necessarily reflect the, the kind of the moral ultimatum of the matter.
Exactly. That's it. And that is exactly why I don't like doing criminal law.
Okay, right, yeah. No, because I can see how that probably would be a heavy thing to carry, like, because you always do you find that, once things have happened, do you find kind of thinking about them a lot, or do you kind of just kind of like, all right, this is done, that's over, we're moving on?
No, I don't really think about it too much. Hardly ever anyways. I think that going to the gym, training, kickboxing, all of that, it helps with that. It's easier to leave a lot of stuff at work, whereas it may not be the same for my colleagues.
Yeah. I mean, but even if you come back to work the next day, do you ever, have kind of these thoughts that come up where you just, something might have finished yesterday, and you're in there today, and you think about, well, maybe this could have been different. And it's not to say that you think that, the outcome wasn't necessarily, just, or something was done wrong.
Yeah.
But like, do you kind of picture alternative outcomes to certain things quite often?
No.
No?
No. And I think that's problematic for me. Like, I find that...
Do you reckon?
I think so. Like, the only reason I think that it's problematic is because for example, if somebody, is sentenced to X amount of years in prison for doing X crime, it's not like a light thing to be taken, right? It's somebody's life, they're going to prison or whatever they've done. For someone to not think about it ever again it's pretty dark. Like, I find that quite dark.
It is, but it's also, you kind of have to think about it like, well, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's not like you can come back to work the next day and say, "Hey, you know what, guys? Let's run this back. I don't agree with this. Let's give this another jam." I mean, hey, like, maybe from a criminal's point of view, they would have been like, "Hey, yeah, no, let's do it again." But in terms of that, I feel like I suppose it's one way to kind of keep yourself sane as well, because otherwise you're going to be thinking about every single thing that you've ever gone through and what impact it's had. So I mean, I suppose I can understand why there needs to be a certain degree of detachment from it. Otherwise you're not going to last very long.
Exactly. That's true.
Yeah.
But it's really sad to think about it like that. It's just another number, just another person, which is only something that I reflect on, not necessarily the case, but like I reflect on the fact that, this is just another person who's just gone through the system and I have no attachment to it. And you shouldn't, like you said, it shouldn't be a thing, but it kind of counters how I feel like I'm so logical about everything else, and then kind of sitting back and thinking, I'm just thinking of this person as just another person. But it's actually, I shouldn't be thinking like that. And it's like a bit of a conflict in my own mind.
I totally understand that. Well, in terms of, most common cases, what do you see happening most often at the moment?
At the moment, because I'm based at the district court, you don't get the crazy serious stuff. But there's a lot more assaults, like quite a lot more in comparison to when I started the job. So during lockdown, there's been a lot more charges of assaults, burglaries. Those are kind of like the majority of the cases. And then you got your usual drink drivings and driving while suspended charges, which are super low level. But I think the bulk of it at the moment is a lot of family violence stuff.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Well, see, it's interesting you say that, because if you do read the newspapers, you see quite a lot of that in there.
Yes.
The pandemic, the lockdown, the kind of the state of the economy at the moment. It's putting a lot of people under pressure, under stress, and I feel like it really kind of spills over into people's personal lives, and I think this is where it goes. And I mean, whether it's in your household or whether it's outside, I just feel like like people are on edge.
Yes.
Shit's a lot more likely to go down.
Definitely.
You kind of interesting, and so and prior to the lockdowns, what did you see more of? Like, how did you see the the pandemic kind of change that landscape?
I suppose in terms of so for example, in the district court, you go into arrest courts, which is overnight arrests. Prior to lockdown, you would see a good 15, 20 people getting arrested, being brought into court, us having to deal with those matters. A lot of them were people breaching their bail rather than new charges against them, whereas during the lockdown, less people breaching their bail, more like new charges of assault and burglary and all that kind of stuff, and less numbers. So at the moment, on any given day, you go into an arrest court, you'll see maybe 5 to 10 people being arrested.
Interesting. Okay, because it almost sounds a little paradoxical when you think about it, because on one hand it sounds like prior to lockdown there was a lot of dealing with kind of recidivism, people kind of, you've done something, you got let out on bail, and then you went and, messed that up as well. Whereas here, on one hand, you're getting people catching, fresh charges, new incidents of crime, but less people being brought in.
Yes.
How does that work?
So, in terms of people being arrested for bail breaches, that doesn't necessarily mean that, like, so for example, the people that are coming into court now, it's not like they're not recidivist offenders. They are people that we see often. The difference is that, say if somebody's out on bail and they breach their bail for whatever reason, they get arrested and brought before the court. So there's less arrests on breaches because I think, I don't know whether this is true or not, but it seems to be that people aren't breaching their bail as much. So people who have already got charges, active charges going through the court, they're not doing anything to mess it up to be coming back to court.
Yeah.
Whereas there are people who may have already had charges dealt with through the court and everything's done and dusted, they've been sentenced, and now they're back before the court on fresh charges.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. It kind of, it makes sense, but it's almost like a case of, if you're on bail, I don't know, if it sounds like people are more inclined to kind of just like stay home. I don't know. Maybe it's the lockdown. They're like, the hell with it. I ain't going nowhere. I'm just going to chill. Where there is those who kind of, may have already had some sort of charges against them in the past. And, chilled out for a bit, decided to kind of, make a return to the courts kind of thing. Yeah. Okay, interesting. Do you find that in terms of new charges, are there a lot of new people coming before the courts? Like once, just actually people that have never committed a crime before? Like this is their first charge?
Not often.
No?
Not often. It's a lot of the time you see very familiar faces. Yeah, which is kind of sad.
And I mean, and on the other hand, it must feel quite weird. You're dealing, you're in your line of work, unlike, a lot of other lines of work, where you might have, repeat clients and, relationships, so to speak. In this one, it's not kind of the line of work where you want to have these sort of relationships where it's like, oh, hey, I've seen you before.
Oh, it's good to see you again.
How you been? Oh, not so good, huh? Yeah. Oh, okay. Interesting. All right. And in terms of how things are dealt with, do you find that the lockdowns have kind of affected that? I mean, because I personally feel like it would, because obviously there's with lockdowns, with people not being able to be present in certain in certain environments. Not to mention just the fact itself of having to kind of get somebody to take somebody somewhere. Like we just don't want to do things right now. Everybody wants to kind of keep things on the down low. Everybody wants to be like, let's just stay at home. Let's stay where we are. We'll deal with this later, kind of thing. Do you find that this has affected the way things are dealt with?
I mean, yes, I guess. A lot of this stuff that is being dealt with at the court at the moment is people who are in custody, whereas people who are remanded on bail, their matters are being adjourned off until they've come up with a good enough health and safety plan for the court staff and everyone present in court for members of the public to start attending their matters again. So a lot of stuff has been put off. So basically just everybody's hearings have been pushed out. Yeah, pretty much. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I do wonder what kind of impact it has on these kind of things, because, you think to yourself as well, just, I suppose, we're not really talking about career criminals of any sort here, but, imagine a person caught a charge somewhere, just went and got into an altercation or whatever, and now you have a pending court case, which, by the sound of it, it always sounds like it's ages away. Somebody catches a charge, it's like, oh, court is next year, and it's like, well, so you walk around for a year just with this great cloud hanging over you, and now it's going to be even longer because it's getting pushed out. Like, do you, what's your view on the impact that has on people? I think that's obviously, obviously I can understand why these kind of things happen, it's a question of resources and,
how there's only so efficient you can be with these things.
Yes.
When you have a million things lined up, and it's like, okay, well, get in line.
Yeah.
But yeah, and from a point of view of kind of somebody's psyche, like what are you, what's your view on that?
I think it would be horrible to have that cloud hanging over your head, especially if it's somebody, who doesn't usually go through the court system. And just imagine, I know there are people who come through court, it's the first time they've ever had a charge which is coming through court, and they've been put on, bail conditions, and then they're having to adhere to these bail conditions. And that is being pushed out further and further and further. So for somebody to be like, oh crap, actually I need to be at home at this time every single day for the next 2 years, it's pretty crazy.
Yeah. No, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Does that change throughout the course of the whole kind of between the time they tell you when that time is and here, do they does that change very much, or is it just kind of like sit out for the whole time? It's like, okay, that's you for the year now.
It can change. So often you need to show that you've been compliant with your bail conditions, or whether there's a change in your circumstances that warrants a change for your bail. Yeah, those are usually the only reasons that they would change it from beginning to end in between.
Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's not really. Well, I suppose like if somebody's kind of on good behavior type deal, it's just like okay, we'll give you a bit of leeway type
pretty
deal.
much.
Okay, interesting. Because I suppose I've known people from all different walks of life. Ones that kind of have heaps of charges that don't seem to really give a shit. They just kind of, for them it's a revolving door.
Yeah.
And I've other guys that have kind of had an unfortunate event. Got into a fight somewhere. They they otherwise are not kind of criminal people.
Yes,
yeah.
And
they've had to deal with these kind of things where I've known a guy that's that's his case kind of took 3 years.
Yeah.
It was a fight at a party.
Yeah.
One of those nothing unusual. Somebody gets drunk, somebody says something, punch up, bam, off we go.
Yeah.
So I mean, for him it took 3 years, and I feel like it really kind of took it out of him. It took him massive emotional toll
a bit,
on him. Yeah, so interesting.
Yeah.
In terms of cases that that are, do you get many kind of false accusations?
You see a few.
Yeah.
It's not a massive thing. I mean, you don't see it often, but
I suppose it carries a risk in itself.
Yes,
It's something
of course,
you kind of
yeah.
have to think twice
Yes.
about, because it's kind of like, well, that in itself is a charge for
That's
you
it.
if you get caught.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's not a common thing. I don't see it often. I think I've been kind of in the criminal justice system for 2.5 years total, like including both jobs that I've had, and maybe seen it once or twice. Yeah, so it's not common. It happens, but personally, I haven't seen it that much.
is it? How big of a deal is it?
From what I've seen, not that big of a deal, which is really bad. Like, so they're kind of, in both instances, it's been quite downplayed that, this person has falsely accused this person of doing something. I personally feel like there's not enough. It's not punitive enough. Our system isn't punitive
to kind of
enough
to put people off
Yes.
from doing that.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, because that's interesting too. I mean, you kind of you do read the occasional newspaper article about something like that happening. So, it seems to put people under a lot of stress, which interesting.
Yeah.
In terms of in terms of the way. Because like there's a bit of a sentiment, right? Do you know much about public defenders?
I do.
Yeah?
Yep.
Do you, like, there's this, like, confusing sentiment because a lot of people seem to think that, these guys aren't very good or something like that.
Yeah.
Is that, like, is that true? Is it a fair thing to say, or is this kind of like a case-by-case type deal?
Definitely case by case. I know some very good PDS lawyers. I know everybody knows that that's what people think about public defenders.
Yeah.
But no, I definitely think it's a case-by-case basis. There are some public defenders I know that are incredible at their jobs and they're very passionate about it. And others, I don't think that it's necessarily that they're a public defender. It's probably the fact that they don't want to be doing their job, or
it's just kind of more down to the individual.
Yeah.
Is there much, like, is there a huge difference between, say, being like a public defender versus being like a pricey lawyer? Because a pricey lawyer is like a private practice, so to speak, isn't it? Yeah. So is there much difference between that? So where do these levels kind of come from, because obviously there are guys that are very expensive, so there has to be a good reason for it.
Yeah. I mean, from what I've seen, there is a reason for it. There's been times where I've sat where the defense lawyer has been like a QC or someone, very well known, very expensive, and their level.
Sorry, what's a QC?
QC is Queen's Counsel, so they're like kind of top lawyers.
Oh, right.
And their arguments are amazing to listen to. It's just very well thought out. I suppose maybe they have more resources because they charge more. They have more people to do more research for them. They have more time. I don't actually know what the reason is, but
yeah, I mean, like, I can understand that. Obviously, from a point of view of someone, like, if I was to look at hiring a lawyer and I had, and I had the money for it, I'd be looking at, okay, what's your record like?
Yes.
It's like, what have you won? Have you dealt with, what kind of cases have you dealt with as well? Like, was this easy? Was this hard? What's your rate of kind of, what would you call it? I know like what rate of conviction, but then, if you're a defense lawyer, it's not like,
you would want the opposite of a conviction, right? Yes.
Is there a name for that? Like,
I don't think so.
The opposite of a rate of conviction? Yeah, because I mean that is something that you would obviously take into consideration, and I can imagine that obviously the more money you get paid, the more resources you have to kind of recruit other things, people to do your research. Is there actually would guys like that ever kind of look into some sort of maybe like a private investigator to help with that research?
Yes, I've seen it. The money kind of goes towards even things like expert witnesses that help their cases. And
what's an expert witness?
So for example, like if somebody's claiming that they're sick from this and that's what led to them committing the crime or whatever, expert witness would be a doctor.
Right. Okay. Man, that's actually pretty crazy. So, because see, like one of the other things I wanted to kind of talk to you about is like the impact that somebody's kind of money, somebody's wealth could make on their shall we say, access to justice, so to speak. Because like if you show up with just one public defender who's just been given to you, versus if you kind of get a pricey lawyer with, private investigators and expert witnesses and stuff. I mean, that's obviously going to make a lot of difference to the way your case is going to be handled.
Definitely.
So do you feel like that makes a lot of difference?
I think so.
Because I mean, to me, that's always been one of these things, like anytime I'd get into an argument with somebody about about justice and courts and laws, etc. My view always has been that there is obviously a bias towards wealthy people. Wealthy people get away with a lot of shit, in society in general, whether it be, before it ever gets to a court, whether you kind of bribed your way past certain things and you just kind of avoided charges in the first place, or once you got to the courts, you're able to kind of lawyer up and throw a lot of resources at that, as opposed to somebody else that would be charged for a similar crime. And I suppose that kind of almost makes me think of the issues with the American justice system as well. Where they always bring up these examples of two of the same cases having massively different outcomes. We're talking about like 6 months home detention versus 10 years of maximum security. So well, what are your thoughts on that? And
I think wealth will only get you off to a certain extent in terms of your charges. So like, for example, you're able to hire somebody who has more experience, who can, who has the resources to try and win your argument, essentially. But I think that what a lot of people don't understand about, when you see two cases that look similar in nature, and you're kind of like, oh, how come this person only got this, whereas this person got this? There's a lot of factors that people take into account, like judges, lawyers, they all take it into account. Often when you do submissions for like for a sentencing or a sentence indication of what somebody would get, you have to look at factors that are aggravating and mitigating, right? So say you've got this person, the media's telling you, okay, they got 6 months home D, and with this person, they're telling you they got 2 years in prison. There's a lot of stuff that leads up to that person being in prison. There's a lot of history. There's like, you look at all the stuff that has accrued over the past few years or whatever of their life.
Well, suppose we're looking at two people that don't have any other sort of criminal records. Because obviously it makes a difference if you're kind of like if you've got previous convictions, if you've got a some sort of history of offending like that. I can understand that obviously makes a difference. But suppose there are two people and whatever their histories are, so is it kind of handled in a sense of like, okay, let's really dig deep and see what has happened? Because I mean, you hear a lot these days, especially when it comes to kind of I suppose gang crime. A lot of the like gang crime incidents, there's a lot of arguments for upbringing. Family history, stuff like that. So is that kind of what we're talking about here? Yeah.
All of that plays into why this person may get something hefty and that person may not. But in terms of if you're talking about two people who, say, I don't know, have the same charge in terms of drink driving or an assault or whatever, more often than not, they end up getting the same sentence. And I think that the problem is the media, because of the media is going to only kind of tell you what they want to tell you, right?
Yeah. I mean, you kind of want to sensationalize certain things.
Exactly.
And I mean, I think with the case of with the cases in America, especially, there's with what's going on there, there's a lot of kind of racial dynamic involved as well. So like obviously, the media gets a lot of clicks out of that. But in terms of aggravating and mitigating factors. I suppose I kind of understand what a mitigating factor is. I mean, for example, would somebody's upbringing be a mitigating or an aggravating factor? It would be an aggravating factor, wouldn't it? If somebody's had a troubled upbringing.
It would be mitigating.
Yeah.
More likely mitigating, because it would explain the reason why they're doing what they're doing.
Okay. What's an aggravating factor then?
Criminal history. The type, say for example, if you've assaulted somebody and you look in your history and there's 10 charges of previous assaults.
Yeah, I mean that's obvious, but like, is there anything that's not related to your criminal record that could be an aggravating factor?
The nature of the offence. So, however the situation played out, that could be aggravating. So, for example,
I suppose how intentional something was. Like I can see how for example, if somebody getting into a fight versus somebody kind of viciously beating somebody when they're on the ground.
Exactly.
And they obviously can't defend themselves.
Yeah. So like one of the big ones at the moment that we always hear about is king hits.
Yeah.
So if you hit somebody in the head, whether it be the lightest punch or something that's serious, that's an aggravating factor to hit somebody in the head, because the likelihood of like permanent damage is higher. So
actually, that's quite interesting because I mean, obviously, that right away brings to mind the recent case that we've had.
Yeah.
In terms of that, has there been much change? Has that had much effect? Because I mean, obviously, it was a very publicized case. There was a lot of kind of high profile people talking about this, and a lot of social media attention.
Yeah.
Has there been much done about that from the point of view of any adjustments being made to?
Not that I'm aware of, but I think that like when I was, obviously I've been around it as well. Like I'm seeing these influential people talk about it and what needs to change in this and that. There's a lot of stuff in place that is kind of already there for what they were trying to advocate for. I think there's just people aren't really aware of it. Like, for example, the aggravating factor of being hit in the head. A lot of people don't know that would add time to whatever sentence you've got.
Right, so it's kind of like, as opposed to somebody getting into a fight with somebody and knocking them out, it's just like, look, there's, clearly an aggravating factor in the fact that you hit somebody when they weren't looking, so you were doing it with malicious intent.
Exactly,
I mean, obviously, ignoring the fact that both you and I kind of, part of the martial arts community and we're a bit more in touch with what was going on, from the point of view of general public and the way, the outcome of that case, do you have an opinion on that?
Not really. I mean, the person who's being charged for it has got his trial next year or at the end of this year or something.
Yeah, because I mean, I can't remember exactly how many people were involved now, because I know one of them got charged. I think he got home D. Was it 6 months?
6 months home detention.
6 months home D. Yeah.
I remember having a discussion with my colleagues, and we actually thought that for the charge and for the summary of the offence that the person had pleaded guilty to, 6 months home detention was actually quite a high sentence. A lot of people thought it was ridiculously low, but
I suppose like you kind of have to also look at it from I suppose a more dispassionate point of view, because when it comes to looking at cases like that, I suppose you got to look at like, okay, who actually did it. I mean, okay, you were there, you're an accomplice, but who's really, who's really the bad guy here? So obviously, you were involved, but right, okay, because like obviously, it kind of there was a lot of backlash around that. There was,
massive,
but I kind of see what you mean. But in terms of what's left to do, I mean, obviously, is that person on remand or not?
I'm not sure. I've only been following it through the media. So
Would something like that get somebody on remand? Well, a better question is what would it take for a case like that to be declined bail?
It's a lot of different factors, actually. So, certain offences fall under certain categories, which means that it's up to the defence and the defendant to prove that they should be let out on bail. Whereas some offences, some defendants, the onus is on the prosecution to prove that they shouldn't be let out on bail. So it's all dependent on a bunch of factors, and the nature of the charge, the previous convictions, whether they've breached whilst on bail before, how many times they've done that.
Kind of like risk of reoffending.
A number of factors.
Is flight risk one of them? Or I suppose it's actually one of those things that I can see like lockdown affecting heavily. It's kind of like, well, look, no one can go anywhere. Where are you going to go?
It is. People do have to surrender their passports. For certain matters.
Okay, so but in terms of somebody not getting bail, would you say it has to be a pretty serious matter for that to happen?
Yeah. So often the three things that we look at, the risk of reoffending, risk of offending on bail, and there was a third one, which I can't remember off the top of my head. And then you look at all these other factors, like say, for example, if there was a victim involved, what the victim thinks of the person being on bail, and proximity to...
Oh, and just, like the impact of that person being back out in the community.
So there's three main factors that you look at when you consider putting somebody on bail, and then all the little things that kind of play into it, which is situational.
Okay. In terms of, I always wondered, in terms of ankle bracelets, right? So I mean, like when you get bail, that doesn't necessarily automatically put you on an ankle bracelet, does it?
No.
Yeah.
No.
So I mean, you might have certain conditions, and they would kind of at their discretion check on you that you're complying. But in terms of ankle bracelets, what warrants an ankle bracelets? I gotta bring this up. Right before, just before Christmas, I went into Sylvia Park. I went and I went into JD Sports, and I looked down. And all I saw was ankle bracelets everywhere. I'm like, okay, there's a lot of people on eBay.
Just before Christmas.
Yeah.
They get let out to go shopping for Christmas often.
So what happens? So you're kind of like, you're on remand, but off you go for Christmas, we'll put a bracelet on you, and then you come back, or what happens?
So obviously it's tracked, right? That's the whole point of you having a bracelet on you. So what warrants a bracelet is usually how serious your charges are, whether you're a recidivist offender, you're somebody who's been brought before the court who is just like a theft under 500. It's quite a minor charge, but you look at their history and they have like 150 thefts under 500. And so you're kind of like, okay, if we're not monitoring...
When we say thefts under 500, so we're talking about kind of like value of what you've stolen?
Yes, yeah.
So what is it called when it's over 500? It has a special name, don't it?
Oh, you're thinking of the American version.
So it's not the same?
Larceny and
grand larceny, not the same thing here?
So we usually bracket it on value, just on value, and it's the same charge. So obviously, the
over
higher
and
the
under
value,
500, okay.
Over the higher the value, not necessarily higher the sentence, but it gets to a point where, yes, your sentence will be maximum penalty is higher than a theft under 500.
Okay.
Yeah. So you've got this person, they've gone out and stolen something from Countdown again, and you look in their history, and they've been doing it for the last 5 years, for example. The only way for you to know that they're not going to reoffend is for you to track what they're doing, where they're going, all of that. Hence, they get put on a bracelet.
Okay.
Yeah. And then obviously there comes there's a whole bunch of conditions that are attached to being on the bracelet. So some people are on a bracelet with a 24-hour curfew. You have to stay at home. And then you get your little exceptions to, go do your grocery shopping or whatever. And that's not usually the case when you're on a 24-hour curfew. Yeah. And then you've got some people who are on a nighttime curfew because they're more likely to offend at night.
Is it usually I know that it's kind of like from up to 6 a.m.
Yeah, so usually
it's up to 6 a.m. Is it 10? Or 7 to 7?
Usually it's 7 to 7. Okay. Then you've got the odd 10 to 6.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, it makes sense.
Yeah.
So, I mean, will people in those situations, are they able to work?
Yep, if they can provide proof that, they're employed, this is their roster, you provide proof that you're working, then...
So you can kind of I suppose, work a day job.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it kind of makes you think, though. Imagine you're working, say, a 9 to 5, and you get stuck in Auckland traffic. Yes. You finish at 5, but you don't get home till 10 past 6.
Yeah. So there's always leeway.
Yeah.
Yeah, you always have, judges usually take that into consideration.
So it's not like they're like, we caught you slipping,
5
man. Sorry, bro, you're going in.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of leeway with that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But in terms of I mean, obviously, I understand that, like, yeah, if it's kind of somebody that kind of keeps offending and, you know, like, it's one way to kind of mitigate that without actually putting them in custody. But what would be like a single crime that would put you on that? Because I mean, it's a pretty gray area, because on one hand, like, you know, if you're a first time offender, you'd either get bail because you're kind of like, okay, it's your first time, or it would be serious enough for you to be remanded in custody. So like, is there such a crime that would kind of warrant a e-bail bracelet on your first go?
I haven't seen it personally, so I wouldn't be able to speak to that, but there have been instances where, you know, the person has very limited history, and they're still asked to be, like, the judges ask defence counsel to put forward a EM bail application rather than just normal bail. It's often violent offending. Yeah, more often than not.
Have you ever seen anybody asking to be put on e-bail?
As opposed to just normal bail?
Normal bail.
Nobody asks for it.
No, because I actually know somebody that asked.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
and that's interesting.
I think the problem there was, like, it was a case of you know, just kind of bad relationship type thing, where there was a matter going before family courts, but in that process, the individual also caught a criminal charge, unrelated.
Right.
But because of that, there was a you know, they almost tried to use that as a way to kind of affect the case of the family court. It's well, you know, look at him, he's out there doing bad things. And because of that, it's just like, well, no, like, this is an isolated incident, and, you know, I'm not involved in this. I don't want it to kind of affect that. And he actually volunteered to put himself on e-bail to try and kind of be like, look, I'll show you what I'm doing.
Right.
So I'm not accused of being somewhere I shouldn't be. Like, you know, this is going to be on record. So he actually volunteered for that.
That is very interesting. I've never come across something like that before.
Literally. I know somebody like that. Pretty intense predicament.
Well, I suppose they had family court proceedings as well, so a little bit different. So I mean, obviously, like, that's a whole different. Completely.
To what you do. All right. So in terms of severity of crimes that you come across, like, what would be kind of the most, you know, the top of the, you know, the heaviest kind of crime that would come across through your channels?
In the first instance, you deal with, you know, pretty serious stuff, like you do get an odd murder charge. You get some quite.
So you actually get those?
You do, but then it gets.
Does it kind of get like? Does it go through like an escalation process of sorts?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So in the first instance, we deal with it, and then it gets passed on, pretty much.
What does it get passed on to?
So if it's a serious charge like that, you obviously have Crown prosecutions dealing with that matter as opposed to police prosecutions. And in terms of defence counsel, more often than not, private defence counsel rather than a public defender. So then, in the first instance, whoever kind of, say for example, you know, it's a person who's been charged with murder, and their bail is opposed, or their bail is opposed. In court, they would apply for counsel to be assigned. And then in the first instance, police prosecutor would deal with it, and whichever counsel from the pool of counsels that the lawyers that they have at the court, they will deal with that application on the day. And then going further, that then moves to Crown prosecutions, and if they want to hold on to that lawyer, then they hold on to that one, or they go and engage in their own defence counsel.
Okay. And like, see, one thing that I've always found quite confusing is the amount of courts, you know, because you always hear all these different terms like, oh, there's a court of appeal, there's a high court. Like, what are the different types of court? Like, it almost sounds like they have different levels of severity, I suppose, of what they deal with.
Pretty much. So district court deals, so they have categories of offences. 1 to 3 is dealt with in the district court. Some category 3s can go to High Court. Category 4 offences go directly to the High Court. Those are murder charges, like serious sexual assault, rape charges. Those all end up in the High Court. District Court usually deals with low-level driving while suspended to, I suppose, the maximum thing that I've seen there is like grievous bodily harm type charges. Yeah.
In terms of, like there's a lot of talk in the newspapers right now about the crime rates being attributed to 501s, right? So, like the people being deported from Australia.
Yes.
In terms of that, I mean, for a lot of it, they kind of classify it as organized crime. Where does that fit in? Is that straight to High Court, or is that?
No, you get them through the district court. Yeah, a lot of.
Or does it kind of depend on the severity, I suppose, as well? Because, obviously there's, kind of your minor charges, altercations, small possessions of something versus, full-on organized crime conspiracies and, gun crimes. Actually, where do gun crimes go?
Some of them come to the district court. Depends on
what
kind of gun crime it is.
Let's talk about people actually shooting, because I mean, there's a difference. Like, okay, if you got a gun, you got a gun, whatever. But there's been all this talk about like, oh well, everybody's shooting. There's been calls to arm the police and all of that. Where does that kind of crime fit into this system?
Again, severity. So you can get people who have shot up a house coming through district court. But then if they've shot and killed somebody, they'll end up in High Court.
Yeah, I mean, like obviously that's murder, but so does it depend on whether there is actually, if somebody's been hit or not?
It can, yep. So all the matters that I've ever dealt with at district court in terms of shootings have been just drive-by shootings or whatever kind of shootings they come through the district court.
So they're kind of they're more like an incident as opposed to, say, a crime where there's actually like a victim, somebody got shot, somebody was, somebody was kind of directly affected by it rather than just kind of scared of the fact that somebody's shooting,
There have been victims. I mean, most of the time there always is, right? Even if it's somebody's car that's been shot on the road, there's a victim because it's their car, their property's been damaged.
Well, I mean, I suppose it's different, like if I come outside and somebody shot up my car versus me being in the car. And I mean, even if I don't get hit, still that's, somebody taking a run at my life as opposed to kind of just sending a message.
I mean, I see them in court, so.
So I mean, they're still kind of.
They're still coming through,
Okay.
Yeah.
So I suppose it's, the severity of it.
Yeah, pretty much.
What like do you often get asked like for tips? Do you ever get somebody come up and say, hey, give me some tips, like not necessarily around like any, specific crime, I'm a criminal, can you help me out? But do people ask you about certain things?
People who know that I'm a lawyer, yes.
Yeah, like what kind of stuff do they ask for?
It ranges.
Better yet, like what? Let's put it that way. Is there anything? I mean, obviously, there'll be a lot of annoying questions where you probably can't answer. I suppose it happens with just about any occupation. But is there anything that you could offer as a tip, like that off the top of your head?
I shouldn't be offering legal advice to people who are family or friends, like ethically. That's not allowed, right? So
I understand that. I'm talking more from a point of view of like a general tip. I'm not talking about, say, I have this issue, can you help me with it? But rather it's kind of like, well, I've never been in trouble, but God forbid something happens. Like what? Like, is there something that I could know that would, potentially?
I suppose so. Like I think this is something that I've offered not through my my role as a lawyer, but as my role through the registry is just informing people of the court process. I think it's quite daunting for a lot of people having to go through court. And if they know, like, you know, this is the first stage, this is the second stage, this is what you can do in between, these are the applications you can make, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's pretty helpful to them, and that's something that I always offer.
Do you reckon you could run us through it? I mean, like in terms of like, you know, and it's, I suppose, it's similar to say, you know, even if, you know, you work at a bank and somebody asks you about the, you know, how do you apply for a mortgage?
Yes.
It's, you know, like similar to that.
Yeah.
Do you reckon you could run us through like how the process works? I suppose, you know, something happens, you're involved in an incident where you're looked at as, you know, suppose the perpetrator of sorts. You know, what would happen?
Okay.
Like you're arrested, you're put in the cells overnight.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so put in cells, next morning you will appear in court. First time offender, I suppose, let's base it on that. You appear in court, your matter gets dealt with. Usually a duty lawyer will deal with your matter. They'll come and talk to you, they'll ask you what you want to do with the matter. More often than not, the matter gets put off for like 2 to 3 weeks to decide whether you want to plead guilty or whether you want to plead not guilty. And then from there, obviously, if you plead guilty, it goes to sentencing. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff involved in there. If it's depending on the charge, the judge may order a pre-sentence report which outlines like you as a person, your background, your upbringing, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that kind of, you know, it's a very straightforward outcome. It's
That
just like,
one
okay,
is,
I did it.
Yeah.
Do what you gotta
And then
do.
you move-
They
over
tell
and
you
done
what you're
with.
doing.
Yeah.
It's over and
Yeah.
done with. But yeah, like, so
Yeah.
suppose you kind of like you don't want to cop a plea.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, say you plead not guilty to the charge 2 to 3 weeks later, or even on the spot you plead not guilty. The case then goes off for a case review hearing, which is when prosecution has to give all the evidence over to defence counsel, and then I suppose defence counsel is looking through the evidence to see whether the charge is proved, whether there's enough evidence for it, and prosecution is doing the same thing. And so, you know, if there's enough evidence to show that that charge has been proved, prosecutions will run with that case. If defence can find flaws in the argument, they then will have discussions prior to the case review to see whether the matter could be resolved in terms of whether the charge could be lowered or
Some sort of like restorative
Yeah,
justice
yeah,
or like
trying to
settlement
kind of-
outside
yeah,
a court
that's it,
type
that's
thing.
it.
Yeah.
if that doesn't happen and at case review you're still remaining, your plea is still are not guilty, it will then, depending on what kind of charge it is, either go down the route of a judge alone trial, which is prosecuted by police prosecutions, or a jury trial, which is Crown prosecutions.
How does that get determined? Because I mean, I've heard, I mean, I could be wrong again, this could be just, you know, some sort of a stereotype, but I heard that going with a jury trial is better than going for the alternative.
I disagree.
Oh yeah?
Yep,
How
and
come?
that I speak from experience of being a registrar in mostly jury trials. It's very dependent, you know. If it's quite a straightforward case, jurors can often be quite emotional.
Yeah.
You
So
know,
that's
right?
that's something that
Yeah.
like we've talked about earlier. I can see that, you know, that would be a factor. You know,
Yes.
obviously, who's in the jury?
Exactly.
What are their experiences in relation to what's on trial? Yeah.
Exactly. So, you know, depending on the charge, depending on the facts of the matter and whatnot, I wouldn't necessarily say it's always better to choose a jury trial. Sometimes I, you know, have had matters come through a judge alone trial, and it's just been, you know, the judges are very logical. They're very good at what they do, and so having that matter before somebody who can be impartial, who doesn't bring too much emotion into it, who can kind of look at it and be like, okay, you know, X, Y, Z, and this is what the outcome should be. So it's all dependent. It's, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
you know, suppose that it's not, you know, the most straightforward of cases, and you know, I have a chance of convincing the jury. Like, I mean, you know, from a point of view of somebody that's on trial,
Yeah.
the way I would think about it is just like, okay, I might have a chance of convincing the jury that, you know, like if I'm not guilty, at least, you know, like I shouldn't be kind of, you know, locked away under the cellar somewhere. You know, I can still kind of show you like, look, okay, this is what happened. I don't know. I suppose you can kind of get them to, you know, to sympathize with you to some extent. You know, and this is something that I, as a person on trial, would be thinking to myself.
Yes.
Is that assumption kind of, is it an assumption that's even worth making, or is it just a stupid assumption to make in the first place?
No, I think that it is worth making, but there's so many different factors you have to take into account, right? Just from what I've seen, and, you know, I remember watching this little study that they had done, and something's real simple, and it's real surface level, but like an example would be, you got two people on trial, one person's extremely attractive, and one person, you look at them and you're kind of just like, oh, you look a little bit, you know, worn down, I suppose, not well dressed.
Yeah. So I mean, like it's a very factors, like it's a very psychological bias.
Exactly.
Yeah, literally, so, it's down to nothing but your perception of the person in front of you. Like, oh, you know, he looks like. I mean, like, you know, like I get it all the time. It's just like, oh, tattoos. You know, like I don't know about you.
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, I get it in the opposite way though. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that to make that assumption that, oh yeah, my peers will be able to see past all of that, it's not a good assumption to make.
No.
Because I think that generally, that humans are very, you know, visual. It's just an example of, you know, if
so I mean, dress well for court if you're going to
pretty
jury.
much, yeah.
Look presentable.
Look presentable.
But in terms of in terms of juries, do you have you ever found that, you know, the juries are more inclined to kind of, which way are they more likely to lean? You know, because I feel like there is still like a general sentiment in, you know, in the public that, you know, you don't necessarily want to lock people away for everything. Yeah. I mean, there are people that are just kind of like a bit quite extreme with it. It's just like, nah, you do the crime, you do the time. But, you know, most people don't want to see people suffer like that. Do you find, which way do you find them leaning? Do they, you know, are they kind of more towards the you know, say the system versus the person on trial? Is there any kind of pattern you've seen, or not really? Not really, no.
I think, I mean, all the matters that I've ever sat in and heard verdicts for, juries they've been quite good. They actually, you know, they take their time. They seem to consider everything. We obviously can't see what they're talking about or what's going on, but there's been times where as a registry staff, I've had to stay in court till 9-10 p.m. because they are looking through everything, making sure that they've got everything right. So, no, I don't think there's like one way or the other. I think that they actually do consider what's been told to them.
And so the decision has to be unanimous?
Not necessarily. So,
because how many people are in the jury? Is 12. It like a standard? Okay, yes, so 12 people.
12, yep. So
is there like a majority decision winner?
Yeah. So it's it needs to be 11 out of 12.
Okay, so it can literally just be down to one person.
Just one person. But even to get to that point, it needs to be there needs to be a certain time that they've deliberated already, over a certain amount of time. So like I think it's something like 6 hours or 5 hours.
Sure.
It needs to be over that, and then even then it's only upon judges' direction that can be considered, that one person can still say, oh no, I'm opposite to what the other are saying.
What's, I mean, again, I could be using American terminology here, but a hung jury, is that a thing?
When...
is it when they just can't...
when
kind of like, you got like 7 people on this and 5 people on that, and we just can't agree. What happens then?
So it's up to the prosecution after that point. So it'll be a hung jury. And then if the prosecutor wants to retry the matter, they can retry the matter.
So they were just like, let's run it back.
Yeah.
New jury,
Yes.
everything, let's do
Yes.
this again.
Yeah.
And the alternative being?
That they drop the charge.
Okay. And would they potentially be able to downgrade it? Could they say, okay, we won't do that, we'll go downgrade the charge? What do you think?
More often than not, they don't, because
No?
the reason that they would get it to a jury stage is because there's enough evidence to show that they can run their case. So they will continue to run it. I remember in the registry there was one jury trial that had come before the court maybe three times. Yeah.
So they were that confident they were going to get it, so just like, nah, run
Yeah.
it back, run it back.
Yeah, because every time it was a hung jury.
Okay.
But they were like, no, this needs to be tried.
Okay, interesting. What, I mean, that kind of makes you think as well. It's kind of like, the third time it came through, or was it the fourth time?
It was the third time.
Third time. So, I mean, like, twice there was this agreement about it,
Yes.
but they were so kind of dead set
Yeah.
on doing this that's quite interesting, it must have been a really interesting case. I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
I'm not going to go into the specifics of it, but yeah, for something like that to happen, where essentially you kind of have two opposing,
Yes.
points of view, where
Yeah.
so to speak, your peers see it as something that's,
Yeah.
like whether
Yeah.
the system's just hell bent on kind of prosecuting you for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for that matter specifically, it was more of like a public interest reason for them to be pursuing the charge. So when a charge is laid, you are supposed to look at whether it would be in the public interest to pursue it. And that
Right, so it wasn't just about the victim at that
No,
point, was it?
no.
So it's kind of just like
for society as a whole.
is it kind of like, I don't know, like setting a precedent for something, so to speak? It's kind of like, look, we need this
Yes.
to come through.
Yes.
And, because does that kind of really apply in the New Zealand justice system, where you kind of have some precedents?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, it does. Yeah.
So I mean, they kind of that's why they pursue this,
Yes.
because they want this to become
Yeah.
the norm, so to
Exactly,
speak.
and also
Yeah.
like kind of encourage the public to be more open about certain things, and be more willing to accept that this has happened or that has happened. So sometimes you need that one matter to go ahead for it to open up the public's mind to.
Would you because I mean, from a public's point of view, especially if you kind of have an say anti-system kind of
Yeah.
point of view, would you there could be an argument that there's an agenda that kind of, there's an attempt to set that as kind of like,
Yes.
okay, we need to make this the new normal.
Yeah.
So even if it's gonna kind of fail twice,
Yeah.
we're gonna go the third time because we need this from this point on
Yeah.
to be a thing.
Yeah, I can see how somebody who's anti-system could see it in that way. I suppose so. Cause
So I mean, I'm not asking you to kind of
Yeah.
to give your opinion on it,
No,
because at the end
yeah.
of the day, that is a massive argument.
Yes.
To kind of look
Yeah.
into to whether it's actually justified or not.
Yes, yeah,
To
yeah.
push such an agenda.
Yeah.
Is it in public
Yes.
interest in fact, or
Yeah.
is it well, whose interest is it in?
Yes,
kind of thing.
yeah. I think that's that could be quite a subjective thing, right? So
Yeah.
it could be that somebody who, say, for example, is anti-system would look at it and be like, oh, they want the public to have there needs to be a certain narrative for the public to think a certain way. Whereas on the opposite end of that, it could be, this is opening the door for others to come forward about certain things, or
for sure, because I mean, that is public interest.
Yes,
in that sense, it's kind of
yeah.
like, we're going to be able to address a certain
Yeah.
problem, where there is the opposite end of that, especially taking into account with how things are at the moment. There'll be a lot of people that are saying, well, it's the government.
Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, in terms of that as well, because from what I know, that's actually a separate branch, isn't it? We have like we have different branches of government in that sense. We have like the justice system, the kind of the Reserve Bank, and then we have the government. Because they're in that sense, like, what's the interaction between the two?
Separation of powers.
Yeah.
It's not completely separate in New Zealand.
Yeah, because I mean, obviously, most of the time, government makes the laws. So it's kind of like, the courts have to deal with them, but the government makes them. It's not the courts that make the laws.
That's the problematic part about the New Zealand system, right? Is that you've got the government and the legislature as one, and judiciary as separate.
Because I found, like, that's actually something that I found quite stupid, if anything. They always wheel out that same guy to like handle all the shit they can't seem to answer. What's his name? Chris Farfoy, I think. He's the immigration minister. Anytime they cooked up some shit that they're not exactly clear on, he just comes out and he stands there like facing the media, and I've heard this happen quite often in recent times with a lot of laws where they're like, okay, we've got this new law, here it is, and then that's when all the questions start coming through from the media or people in general. What happens if this happens? Like, for example, a good example would be the hate speech. Like, what happens if somebody calls somebody a Karen? What does that? Essentially a lot of the time they try to kind of like, okay, we made the law, but we'll palm that off to police to enforce. We'll palm that off to the courts to kind of interpret. So like, in terms of that seems a little bit counterintuitive. I mean, I feel like from the court's point of view, they'll be a little bit pissed off. It's kind of like, oh man, these guys have made another law again. Like, you don't know what's happening, but you expect me to, kind of thing.
Exactly. It is a little bit difficult. It's you kind of just have to navigate it as it comes at you, really.
So I mean, it puts quite a bit of responsibility on the judges from that point of view, right?
Massive responsibility. Yeah.
I mean, it's quite interesting too, because I mean, what does it actually take to be a judge? Because it sounds like it's a huge responsibility. Like, you're not. It's to some degree, it's like, I would put it on par with being prime minister or something like that, because I mean, look, what a prime minister does has impact on society and a lot of people at large, but as a judge, especially when cases come in front of you, there's a lot of responsibility on you, because you're dealing with that person's life. So I mean, like, but with prime ministers, they kind of, they campaign, there's the whole voting process and all of that. Whereas with judges, they just show up. I mean, it's not like we vote on judges, No.
They are appointed.
Who appoints them?
I should probably know that, but I don't.
Yeah.
But all judges that I know have been lawyers in the past, just very good.
I mean, lawyers, it sounds like that's what you'd have to be. Essentially, you're kind of, you practice the law to be able to actually interpret it to such an extent where you're able to pass the judgment, as opposed to just kind of, argue about it.
I've never actually looked into the criteria of what you need to do to be a judge. I just interact with them and know that they're very switched on, so I'm assuming that they're just
really good lawyers.
Yeah.
Because I mean, like, and in terms of that as well, do you see, to me, it sounds like a lot of them would be quite old, because you'd have to be in the game for a while for you to get to that level, no?
Yeah, I think most of them are obviously older than mid-40s. You get a couple who are in their 40s. And they're considered quite young judges.
Okay, cool. Well, because that's kind of what I was thinking. It's like, I can't imagine there'll be too many judges in their like 30s or anything like that. Like, you're looking at spending somewhere around 20 plus years in the game.
Solid amount of time.
As as a lawyer, just full time in there practicing.
I think some of the judges that I used to interact with, they told me maybe like 10, 12 years of just solid practice. And then have ended up becoming judges. I'm assuming that somebody puts their name forward for it or something along those lines, but
sure. I mean, it'll be interesting to know, because I mean, like, then again, in America they have like their own systems with all these like senates and everything like that.
Very different to ours.
I don't know whether I mean, I can't imagine MPs doing it. Would it be them?
I
I mean, I hope not anyway. Like, you look at these MPs,
Yeah.
and a lot of them are so hopeless that, like, you're like, do I trust you with doing that?
yeah. I don't think so. I don't think that's how it works. But I could be wrong. Yeah.
Okay, well, you know, I hope not anyway,
Yeah.
yeah. Because, yeah, I mean, with the kind of mess they got going on right now, it's, yeah. Well, you know, to kind of like, to cap it all off, what do you think, you know, like being where we are now, you know, there's been a lot of social impact from the pandemic. There's every other day, especially this week, you know, I've been reading a lot of newspaper articles about how, you know, inflation's going up, people are losing jobs, people are like missing out on things, they're just not keeping up. So, I mean, that to me sounds like a recipe for an elevated crime rate.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you feel like that it's something that you can kind of, from your view as a person that's, you know, kind of, I would call it, you know, somewhat on the front line of what's going on. Do you see that maybe getting worse a little bit?
I do. I think violent crimes are getting worse, just from what I see. Property crimes, the whole stealing stuff. A lot of people stealing food, which is indicative of what you're saying in terms of people losing their jobs and whatnot. So yeah, it's definitely having an impact, and you see it in the crime.
Do you see a lot of drug crime in your?
Massive.
Yeah.
Massive.
So do you like in terms of that? Because I mean that's one other thing that, you know, I suppose I'll tie it into some of the other episodes that I do, but I do feel like, you know, it's drugs are usually a reflection of, you know, of the state of the society from both ends, from the consumption as well as the commerce.
Yes.
You know, because, you know, when there's a lot more drug dealing when there's not enough jobs, and there's a lot more consuming drugs when there's not enough jobs. You know, like people's mental health and all that. Do you see very much of that, and have you seen kind of a pattern in recent times, up or down?
I haven't seen an escalation of it during this pandemic. It seems to have remained the same, but that's not a good thing because it's already quite a high. But it doesn't seem to have escalated during this time. Perhaps.
Because I mean, I suppose you also have to take into account the logistics of it. I can imagine, you know, we're not exactly getting a whole lot of, you know, we live on an island. This stuff has to come from somewhere. So, you know, given that we can't even get our parcels into the country, I feel like, you know, drugs would be a bit harder as well.
Yeah, definitely. You do see a lot of, users coming through the court.
In terms of users, I mean, I feel like there's been a bit of a shift in the landscape as to, you know, the prosecution of people that are using. You know, it's kind of, there's a push to treat it more as a problem as opposed to being a crime. Has it, you know, like, has there been a lot of change around that?
Well, yes, there has. So there is kind of like a subset to the court called the Alcohol and Other Drugs Court. And they deal with people who are recidivist offenders who commit crimes because of alcohol or other drugs. And so they come through that pathway, and that is to kind of, you know, help them get clean or understand why they're doing what they're doing. And, you know, it's more of a hands-on approach to what your normal court process would be.
In terms of, you know, obviously possession and quantities, right? So I mean, there's a line between kind of consumption and distribution. Has there been much change in the, because, you know, like I feel like back in the day, I mean, don't quote me on this, but I feel like back in the day, like you get caught with some drugs, you got drugs, that's it. We don't care what you were doing with them and how you came to have them, whether you were going to use them or whether you were going to sell them, you got drugs, it's illegal. Whereas, you know, now it's kind of like, okay, well, you might be a user. You know, but in terms of that, how much, you know, has there been much change in the leeway as to what's considered personal use versus
Yes.
what's considered distribution?
I don't know whether there's been any changes, but from what I have, you know, come into contact with, there is over a certain amount for different drugs.
Yeah.
That means it's for possession or for supply. So if it's personal use, it'll be below a certain amount, and it's objective. There's a set amount. Over that amount is for supply. Under that amount is personal.
Has it actually, with, you know, in regards to marijuana, obviously we've had the whole referendum, it didn't pass.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember, did we ever decriminalize it?
No.
We didn't.
No.
So you can still
Yes.
catch a charge for possession.
Yes.
I mean, it's crazy because you know, different countries have different approaches. Like, you know, in the States, there's a lot of states that have decriminalized it. You go to Russia, I have guys that are doing 6 years for a pound.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's, you know, like from a point of view, if anybody knows weed out there, you know, a pound of weed isn't that much.
Yeah.
Like, it's a lot, but it's not, you know, you're not any sort of kingpin
Yeah.
because you got a pound of weed, you know, but these guys are catching 6 years,
Yes.
hard time for that.
Yeah.
So, you know, like over there, they're very strict with these things. In terms of that over here, is this something that kind of has been changed on the legislative level, or is this kind of more just like the police discretion towards it has changed?
Definitely police discretion.
Yeah.
Legislatively, I don't think anything has changed, but
And there's no plans around that?
not that I'm
Yeah.
aware of. But there has been a lot of relaxation in terms of prosecution for it.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good. Hopefully, I was really hoping they would decriminalize it. Well, not just decriminalize it, like legalize it. I feel like it would be a good industry for New Zealand,
For New
to be
Zealand,
honest.
definitely,
And
yeah.
I mean, when we're talking about weed, it's a whole, like, it's very different to, you know, your kind of destroyer
Your
of
hard
worlds, you know,
drugs,
your,
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
meths and heroines and
Agreed.
etc. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, you tend to see that as well with, you know, you see the difference when people come through court.
yeah. I mean, different, you know,
Yeah.
the users of
Yeah.
different substances, but
Exactly.
obviously, you know, have
Yeah.
different kind of crimes attached to
Yes.
them, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, look, no, that was really interesting. I really appreciate you coming through
Thanks
and
for
sharing the
having me.
knowledge with us.
Thanks for
Eh?
having me.
Yeah,
It was awesome. Yeah.
yeah. No, I love delving into these things. You know, like, because I have my views on you know, various things, but it's also like it's always very nice to see kind of how things actually are and kind of take that in and learn something.
Well, I'm glad you did. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you. I really appreciate
You're
it.
welcome.